Hello, so So I am embarking on a new project which I'm really excited about, and I thought it might be fun to share a bit of the history behind the style that it's drawing from and talk about my plans for where it's going to go. So I've been really wanting to have a big embroidery project for a little while, something that's going to last me a really long time, like really long, and that I can just pick up and have on the go for, in the evenings, when I'm just tired, when I don't want to fully sew, when I'm watching TV, on my way on holiday, all those kinds of things. So I just finished a small crewel work embroidery, which was this one here that I've done. I've finished it quite recently. I got it as a gift a long time ago as a kit. So that's going to become a cushion, but there is a limit to how many cushions I actually need. And I wanted something that might be a bit more displayable and a bit bigger. And I was thinking a wall hanging, but that's not really something I can necessarily put up in a rented flat, So I decided to go for a skirt as a really nice simple shape, something I could wear and just kind of go a bit mad with the design on. And so I'm going to be doing more crewel work in the kind of the style of the later 17th to sort of shifting into the early 18th century. So before I go into my plans for the design of that, I thought it might be nice to take you through some of the history behind the embroidery of this time in general. So embroidery in 17th and 18th centuries was a craft that was undertaken both by professionally employed embroiderers and by amateurs in the home. And when I use the word amateur, and when a lot of people use the word amateur in these kinds of contexts, it's not meant to be a sort of derogatory term that implies lack of skill or anything like that, although it has often been equated with, the women working at home, oh, they're not as skilled, and the men working in the workshops, and they must be more skilled. And I really don't mean it like that, because you can get amateur, sort of non-professional maybe is a better word, but it's a bit less catchy, embroiderers who are, incredibly talented people. I don't mean unskilled or inexperienced, but simply those who are producing embroideries domestically in the home for themselves, for their household, or maybe also for their social networks as gifts, rather than undertaking paid employment in embroidery. So by the 17th century, embroidery had come to take its place as part, kind of wrapped into the ideas of ideal womanhood, and it was viewed as an activity which was both useful to the household as just like a source of production, providing decorative and functional goods for around the house, furnishings, clothing, etc., accessories. But it was also framed as this industrious activity that could keep women occupied, distracting them and kind of keeping their hands busy so they didn't get involved in sort of the sins of gossip or, God forbid, kind of sexual activity, or kind of wasting their time or being lazy. And so it was kind of framed as like a religious, religious and social activity that kind of upheld the structure of the fabric of society, which is quite a lot for just embroidery. And some associated with teaching women of the virtues of humility and chastity and modesty and obedience and all these kinds of things. And that was often tied into the sorts of things that you might stitch, especially as a young girl, when you're undertaking your early education, which tended to consist of two samplers, one which was kind of a bit plainer, one which was more colourful, and then potentially some kind of bigger project like a basket or a casket. And often those would have bits of text which you would be writing out, and they might be Bible extracts or just kind of words to live by for a woman, like be obedient and things like that. Now, how much needlework actually achieves any of these things is questionable. I think anyone who stitches knows that it doesn't necessarily come with kind of quiet obedience and humility, depending on the person doing it. And it was also an idea that was satirised at the time too. So it's not necessarily something that everyone is thinking like, yes, a woman who embroiders, she's perfectly obedient. But in the kind of ideological and like advice conduct book rhetoric, it was framed as that. Embroidery and other sewing work was often done as a communal activity. It might be something where you'd have all sort of levels of the household come together, so the mistress of the house, her daughters maybe, servants also, and maybe also outsiders from outside of the house, like family or friends too. And so you'd be stitching together, you might even be working on the same larger project. So actually it was probably almost certainly an excellent place for kind of chatting, gossiping about your neighbours, all these kinds of things that they're saying that it distracts women from. And kind of a bit more significantly, one of the most well-known books on the history of embroidery, called The Subversive Stitch by Roszika, which I highly recommend if you've heard of it and not read it, or never heard of it. It's a really excellent book from the 70s, I think. And she's kind of pointing out how embroidery isn't just, she sort of wants to bring more embroidery back and other kind of needlework from this idea of just like a domestic craft that wasn't valuable or skilled, but also it wasn't purely about kind of women's obedience and submissiveness. And although it was framed like that in quite a political way, women also found spaces for kind of resistance and even kind of outright political statements through their works of needlework and embroidery, you know, often depicting scenes which had political meanings for whatever events were going on at the time. And so embroidery, it could mean a lot of things, and it would obviously be different for different people, just like it is today. So while this isn't the style that I'm going to be using for my project, probably my favourite 17th century kind of type of embroidery is raised work, which was also known as stump work. It's a bit of an archaic term now because it's a bit rude, sound like a bit mean sounding. But this is a wonderfully like three-dimensional style, which partly because of three-dimensionality and partly because of the sort of style of the time, ends up in these quite odd looking animals and also people who are in the scenes with these really excellent expressions, I think. And yeah, what I really love about 17th and early 18th century embroidery styles is a lot of them, especially those with animals and people in, are quite kind of naive in style and kind of idiosyncratic looks to the animals in particular. They aren't very realistic, but they have a lot of personality, and there's a lot of memes about them because they're really funny. So the type of embroidery that I'm doing is known as Crewel work embroidery, and this actually doesn't refer to any of the stitches that are used, unlike say sort of raised work or stump work where you're specifically talking about three-dimensional stitching or cross stitch, which obviously is using cross stitches. But it refers to the 2-ply worsted wool, and that's what you're using to do your stitches with, and that's what makes it Crewel work. And so you can use all sorts of different kinds of stitches with this. Some of the most common are just sort of long laid stitches, which is often called long and short shading, where they kind of are done and they interlock in two different colours or more colours to create like a gradient effect. Couching is quite common. Stem stitch, French knots you see, and satin stitch as well is very common just for filling areas. So Crewel work is also typically done on a linen twill ground, which may be a linen cotton blend, so not a blend, a linen warp and a cotton weft. So I haven't got my fabric that I'm using for mine because it's soaking to try and soften the linen up a bit, but this is the fabric that was on the sample, on the kit one that I got, and it's this really lovely quality, and it's got this kind of slightly ribbed or raised, I don't know if that's coming up on the camera, but it's got a really lovely texture to it, and because it's linen, as it kind of gets worked with and used, it kind of develops a really nice sort of quite soft drape. So that's really lovely. Quite expensive though, unfortunately, which is, as I found out when I wanted to make my skirt and needed more than a 25cm piece. So because it's defined by the thread that you're using, the use of the wool thread, it spans a really long time period in what we can kind of say Crewel work was used in, and isn't sort of slotted into a specific style or form. It's kind of free-form embroidery, uses those stitches that I've mentioned, but any stitch can be used for Crewel work. So actually probably what is the most famous piece of Crewel work, even if it's not generally thought of as such, is the Bayeux tapestry. Not a tapestry in embroidery, as a lot of people now know, which is done in wool threads, which makes it Crewel work. But the kind of era that it's most well associated with, the style that comes to mind when people think of Crewel work, if they think of anything, is this kind of 17th century style that I'm going to be using. And that was also then really popularly revived much later on during like the arts and crafts movements as sort of like a really nice sort of nature embracing, naive, pre-industrial kind of a style. So you get a lot of patterns and kind of Edwardian era crewel work as well, which sort of harks back to the 17th century days and exactly the same. So the 17th century style is the one I'm going to be going with, and it's often known as Jacobean crewel work. This isn't like a totally accurate name because it doesn't just line up with the reign. It goes quite a lot beyond it too. But, you know, if you're looking for design inspiration, Jacobean crewel work is one thing to search for. Flowers and leaves usually dominate the designs. They're very much about nature. Animals are sometimes interspersed amongst them as well. And a really common motif, one of the main ones, is the tree of life. And so this takes the form of hummocks or little hillocks along the bottom of your panels. So you've got like bed hangings or wall hangings. So you have lots of little hummocks along the bottom. And then an often quite twisty tree trunk or branch with its own branches coming off it sometimes as well, going up the height of your panel. So I have two kind of really big favourite things about this style. One is that they weren't that fussed about it being particularly realistic. So proportions are often way off. So like the animals on the ground might be much smaller than the ones in the tree, even if the one on the ground is a lion and the one in the tree is a squirrel. So in my design I have a really massive squirrel, a really small lion on the ground, and I just really love that. I think it's really funny. And I like the idea that you're not necessarily being beholden to kind of natural proportions. And the other thing is the leaves. The leaves are just amazing, and some of them in particular, they're really sort of curly, sinuous things. Again, not super realistic, although since I've been looking at a lot of the designs, when I'm out and about and seeing, you know, trees and leaves and all these things, I start seeing those shapes in them as well. And what's really nice is they often kind of have the edges like curling over or like folded over, and so you sort of get the front and the back of the leaf visible, which leaves some really nice opportunities for doing some fancy things or interesting things with the stitches to kind of indicate that difference. So those are two features I was really keen to make sure I was having in my design. So in the period, the designs for these patterns came from a few different sources, and again, it might just depend on who you were, it might depend on how much money you had, it might depend on how much you liked each part of the job or how much time you had available to you, what method you used of kind of putting together or having a design for your embroidery piece. So they could be purchased actually already marked up on fabric in pre-made designs, much like modern kits today. If you just wanted that for ease. You could also have a pattern designed or created for you, which might be done by a professional pattern drawer, or sometimes a family member might be just really good and you'd ask them to put something together for you. And then you might also just create your own design. There were pattern books, embroidery pattern books, which had like individual motifs and sometimes a little scene, which you copy out and put together into a design, or just use one on a repeat. And people also use some designs have been traced to books which weren't actually intended as embroidery pattern books, but were kind of like, here's a bunch of animals with pictures of them and descriptions of them, and you might kind of trace an animal shape out of that and use it for your embroidery as well, which I think is really great. Kind of, yeah, people weren't just using these embroidery books, they were using whatever they had to hand or whatever it was that they found inspiration in. And that's also like today too. A lot of this is kind of like, well, that's actually pretty similar to how people do things today, even if the designs and styles have changed or the kind of technology that we use to do that with has changed. And the same is true for transferring the pattern onto the fabric. So a very common thing was pricking and pouncing, which some people still do today, where you poke holes around your pattern and then use a chalk or like charcoal dust, which is sort of from like a little bag, and kind of rub it over, and it just comes through the holes and leaves the pattern outlined for you. Similar effect if you're using kind of like chalk tracing paper and a tracing wheel. You could also draw it on freehand if you wanted, and so those chalk markings might just be left as is, or they might also be traced over with ink, and I think that would probably vary depending on kind of how long you're going to be taking to do that work, because obviously the chalk or the charcoal dust could rub off eventually, but if it's just one small piece and it's always going to be sitting in the frame until it's done, probably be okay to not have it traced over. So what am I doing for my project? I've already said I'm doing a skirt. I'm not at all aiming for historical accuracy in the shape or design of the skirt. I did, having already decided to do a skirt, later find an example that I think is 18th century from, I think it was the MFA Boston, where it's like a normal kind of petticoat looking skirt, and then it's got a border that's been applied along the hem, which is in Crewel work, and it's like the standard sort of design of like little hillocks and like little trees and animals, which is really lovely. And maybe I would have done that if I'd seen that first. It would have been a much smaller project because it would have been quite a narrow border, like this sort of size. But I set my heart on first on copying a skirt I already have, which is actually from, I don't know when in the 19th century. When I got it, it was just kind of 19th century underskirt. It's like a flannel underskirt, wool flannel underskirt with a yoke. The top kind of maybe this much is a cotton, like a kind of canvasy cotton, so it's smooth, and then it's the wool flannel with a couple of pleats just to give it a little bit of shape, and some pin tucks along the bottom, although I'm not going to do that on this one. And I really love it. I love the shape it has. I love that it's like historical but also not super long, and really easy to wear, and so I love it. So I'm copying that, and it's a good shape because it's got a lot of like just sort of empty space, especially when I take out the pin tucks. It's all just really simple. There's not much by way of design line. It's just 6 panels, 2 front, 2 side, 2 back. They're only small pleats, so it's not going to interrupt the design too much. But it also means, because I'm expecting this project to take me quite a long time, it means that it's a little bit more adjustable for when I finally manage to get to the point of sewing it up, and hopefully it will actually still fit me when I come to finishing it. So I'm using the Tree of Life as the basis of my design. There'll be one on each of the 6 skirt panels, and they're going to be mirrored. So the front, it will be kind of, 2 mirrored trees. The sides will be mirrored to each other, although you won't be able to see it, and then the back will also be mirrored, just to kind of mostly save me on designing time. So I used Illustrator. First I made the pattern, which was quite straightforward and easy because it's very simple. Then I kind of sketched in my basic design, so I put in the hillocks along the bottom, got those to how I wanted them, and then just did a sort of quite a sketchy, like couple of wavy bits for each of the trees and their branches, just to kind of get a sense of the distribution of things. Then I went through like loads of original sources to pick out motifs that I wanted to use in mine of animals, leaves and flowers. So I got those from original pieces of embroidery that are in museum collections that I could find available online. I got them from pattern books, original pattern books, because there was a couple that I saw when I was researching an essay I wrote last year. And I got a couple from one of those animal books I was talking about that wasn't actually intended necessarily as a embroidery pattern book, but was used by some people for it, which again I had pictures of from when I went to go view it for an essay I wrote a little while back. So I gathered all those together. I then just popped them into Illustrator and literally traced over them like by hand, so that I had this whole bunch of like flowers and leaves and animals that I could use, and just move them around, get them where I wanted, get everything looking how I wanted, get them to the size I wanted. And it was a really good way of doing it. Quite time consuming, but then I didn't have to try and draw these out myself, which isn't something that I think I would have done very well at. And then once I had my placement all right and I was happy with that, I went in with the colour. I decided to set a colour palette to start off with, because I didn't want to end up using 10 different shades of pink. So I set out my kind of colour palette first, so I had dark blue, mid blue, light blue, dark pink, mid pink, light pink, all the colours that I knew I was going to need, but just kind of a few shades of each. And so then I went through using that colour palette to kind of colour it in, to get my colours assigned to where I wanted them to be, and just check that it all kind of looked nice and cohesive and period-ish, And then it was done and ready to go. So I'm using standard Crewel work materials. I'm using the linen twill for my fabric. And then I'm just using standard Crewel work wools. So I'm using Appleton's as the brand. They just arrived recently, so these are my wools. Really happy with them. They're such gorgeous colours. They come in so many colours. It took me ages just to be like picking out the right pinks and the right blues, but it was a lot of fun. And I will be doing this in an embroidery hoop rather than a frame. So yeah, really straightforward set of materials, a little bit expensive for doing a project of this scale, but doing a small project, I mean, each of those wools is like £1 or £2, I think, per skein. So it's actually, it's not too expensive to do if you just want to do a little one. I'd highly recommend it. So yeah, I'm really excited about this project. It's definitely going to take me like a long time. I mean, potentially years. Every time I tell someone about it, they're kind of like, that's a bit crazy how long that's going to take you, but that is what I want. I want something that I can just pick up and put down for ages and not to kind of keep setting up a new thing. And really, it's not about the final product for me. For this one, sometimes it is. It's about having the thing to wear or use, but for this one, it's really about it actually having the making to do. So I'm really excited about it. Let me know if there's any questions that you have about this project or about kind of 17th century embroidery more generally. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Bye. Maybe even working on one big project together too. Ooh, a fly. Oh, my head. Oh. Ow. Okay. Whew. Ah. Okay, let's start that sentence again. I'm super duper excited. Super duper.